The most dangerous professionals in any society are not the ones who want to harm people. The most dangerous are the ones who have identified harm as a business strategy and are systematic enough to execute it without getting caught. They exist in a particular category of criminal psychology that researchers call predatory competence. Individuals who are genuinely skilled at their legitimate profession, who use that skill and the trust it generates as cover for something that would make the patients who trusted them physically ill to contemplate. Elliot Marsh was a licensed pharmacist for 29 years. He was, by professional evaluations and customer reviews, an excellent one. He was patient with elderly patients who needed their prescriptions explained 4 times. He remembered people's names. He noticed when a new medication might interact dangerously with one a patient was already taking and called the prescribing physician to flag it. He was, in the vocabulary of everyone who interacted with him professionally, trustworthy. Between 2009 and 2022, Elliot Marsh deliberately dispensed incorrect medications, incorrect dosages, and in several cases, substances that were not medications at all, to patients who had no idea anything was wrong. 17 people were hospitalized. 3 people experienced serious, lasting health consequences. And Elliot Marsh collected $2.7 million in fraudulent insurance reimbursements that he spent on a second home, a boat, and an investment portfolio he expected would fund a comfortable early retirement. He was caught because of a spreadsheet, not a police investigation, not a whistleblower, not even a complaint from a patient. A spreadsheet maintained by an insurance company's algorithmic fraud detection system flagged an anomaly in his reimbursement patterns. From that single data flag to Elliot Marsh in handcuffs took 11 months. What it uncovered in those 11 months is the subject of this investigation. Elliot Marsh was born in 1964 in a suburb of a mid-sized city in the American Midwest. He was, by all academic accounts, the type of student teachers remember not because he was a prodigy, but because he was reliably excellent. He graduated near the top of his pharmacy school class. He worked for a national chain pharmacy for 7 years after graduation, earned consistent performance reviews, and in 1999 opened his own independent pharmacy in the town where he had grown up. The pharmacy occupied a corner storefront. It was the kind of place that was objectively inconvenient. The parking was limited, the interior was not modern, the checkout technology was perpetually 3 or 4 years behind what the chain pharmacies used. And yet, the pharmacy thrived because Elliot Marsh understood that independent pharmacies survive on relationships, and he built relationships with skill. He knew his regulars. He knew which ones were struggling financially and quietly adjusted their wait times and consultation schedules so that they minimized copay confusion. He was active in the community. He sponsored the local Little League team. He was on the hospital's community advisory board. The picture that emerged during the investigation was of a man who had constructed, consciously and deliberately, a reputation for trustworthiness that he then used as a structural element of his fraud. The reputation was not incidental to the crime. It was load-bearing. In 2008, 1 year before the fraud began, Elliot Marsh's personal financial situation shifted significantly. He had taken out a second mortgage on his home in 2006 to fund a minor renovation that expanded the pharmacy's retail floor space. The renovation cost more than projected. The expanded floor space performed below projected revenue. Simultaneously, a national chain opened a location 6 blocks away, drawing off the casual customer traffic that had contributed to the pharmacy's cash flow. Marsh's personal and business finances, which had been comfortably healthy for most of the previous decade, were under genuine pressure. He did not, as far as investigators could determine, immediately decide to begin the fraud. The financial stress built for approximately a year. The methodology appears to have developed gradually. A small discrepancy here, a billing adjustment there, before scaling into the systematic operation it became by 2011. The fraud operated along 3 parallel tracks, which Elliot Marsh ran simultaneously and which were designed to be independently deniable if any single track was ever examined in isolation. The first track was the simplest, billing insurance companies for medications that had not been dispensed. A patient would come in with a prescription. Marsh would fill it, and then he would submit an additional insurance claim for a second fill of the same prescription in the same month, claiming the patient had returned for a refill that had not in fact occurred. This is called phantom billing in insurance fraud terminology. For drugs with low copays and modest unit costs, the individual claims were small. Across a patient roster of several hundred run consistently for years, it added up to several $100,000 before investigators even reached the more serious conduct. The second track involved substituting generic medications, which Marsh obtained at lower cost, while billing the insurance company for the brand name equivalent at the brand name price, and pocketing the difference. This practice, known as drug substitution fraud, is more complex to execute because it requires maintaining 2 parallel inventory systems. Marsh did this by keeping meticulous records in a personal spreadsheet maintained on a laptop that was never connected to the pharmacy's networked systems. The spreadsheet was the document that ultimately became the primary evidence in the prosecution. When investigators found it, Marsh's defense attorney reportedly said, "Nothing for approximately 45 seconds." The third track is the most disturbing, and it is the one that resulted in patients being hospitalized. For a subset of patients, specifically patients with chronic conditions who required regular monitoring and who were insured by a particular carrier with premium drug reimbursement rates, Marsh dispensed medications at incorrect dosages. In most cases, the dosage was reduced. The patient received less of the medication than prescribed. The insurance was billed for the full prescribed dosage. The health consequences varied by drug and patient. For some, the reduced dosage simply meant the medication was less effective than it should have been. For patients on cardiovascular medications, blood pressure drugs, or treatments for thyroid conditions, the consequences were more serious. The patients who were hospitalized did not know they were receiving incorrect dosages. They believed they were taking their medication as prescribed. When their conditions worsened, they called their doctors. The doctors adjusted the prescriptions. Marsh sometimes filled the adjusted prescriptions at the new dosage and sometimes continued dispensing at the original reduced dosage while billing for the adjusted amount. The pattern was not consistent enough across all patients to trigger a clinical alarm. It was consistent enough in aggregate to produce a detectable statistical anomaly in insurance billing data. The 17 individuals who were hospitalized as a result of Elliot Marsh's conduct span a range of ages, conditions, and outcomes. Because some have chosen not to be identified publicly, I will use only first names and general descriptions here, consistent with the way the prosecution summarized these cases in the court record. Margaret, 71 years old, was a retired school librarian who had been managing atrial fibrillation with a blood thinner for 8 years without incident. In 2014, she had a stroke. The stroke left her with permanent partial paralysis on her right side. Her cardiologist, reviewing her records after the fact, could not understand why the blood thinner levels in her bloodstream at the time of the stroke were significantly below therapeutic range. She had been taking the medication faithfully, she told him. She had been picking it up from Marsh's pharmacy faithfully. She was, she said, meticulous about it. Raymond, 58 years old, was a machinist who had been managing type 2 diabetes for 11 years. In 2016, he was hospitalized with a hyperglycemic crisis that required 4 days of intensive monitoring. His A1C levels, which had been consistently in an acceptable range for years, had risen steadily over the preceding 18 months in a pattern that his endocrinologist attributed to what she described as non-compliance, the medical establishment's term for a patient who's not taking their medication correctly. Raymond was, by his own account and his wife's, taking every dose as prescribed. The problem was not his compliance. The problem was that the medication he was taking was not what had been dispensed. There are 15 others. Each one has a version of the same story, a worsening condition, a confused doctor, a patient who was certain they were doing everything right and was being gently accused, in the language of clinical notes, of failing to follow medical advice. The psychological impact of this secondary harm, being made to feel responsible for a health crisis that someone else caused, is something the prosecution's expert in trauma medicine addressed at length in the trial. Patients who were harmed by Marsh's conduct were, in some cases, continuing to blame themselves years after the fact. In October 2022, an automated fraud detection system operated by a regional health insurance company generated a report flagging pharmacy accounts in the covered area with statistically improbable reimbursement patterns. The system, which the insurance company had deployed 18 months earlier as part of an industry-wide initiative prompted by the scale of COVID-era pharmacy fraud, was designed to identify pharmacies where the ratio of high-value drug claims to dispensing volume fell outside normal distribution patterns. Marsh's pharmacy appeared in the report, not at the top of the flagged list, but in the middle. There were 6 pharmacies with more anomalous patterns. The insurance company's fraud unit opened preliminary reviews on all 6. Marsh's review was handled by a fraud analyst named Dana Pryor, who had been with the company for 4 years and who, in her own account of the case, almost closed the Marsh file after the first 2 weeks because the initial anomalies appeared explainable by the pharmacy's unusual patient demographics. It served a higher proportion of elderly patients, which naturally skewed drug costs upward. What kept Dana Pryor looking was a detail that the algorithm had flagged, but that required a human to interpret. The pattern of claims that were inconsistent was not random. It was skewed toward specific drug categories: cardiovascular medications, thyroid treatments, diabetes drugs, the categories where underdosing would cause delayed but measurable health deterioration. Dana Pryor had no clinical background. She described later in testimony seeing that pattern and feeling that it was wrong in a specific way, not just statistically wrong. she escalated the case to the company's external investigation unit. The external investigation unit brought in a licensed investigative firm. The investigative firm, over the next 4 months, built a case that they brought to state law enforcement in February 2023. When state investigators received the insurance company's referral, they faced an unusual challenge. The evidence they had was financial. It demonstrated compellingly that reimbursement claims from Marsh's pharmacy were fraudulent. What it did not yet prove was which specific patients had been affected or how the drugs that were billed had differed from the drugs that were dispensed, proving that required cooperation from patients, their physicians, and, most critically, a search of the pharmacy that would uncover Marsh's own records. Investigators spent 3 months building parallel tracks. On the financial side, forensic accountants mapped the full scope of the billing irregularities. On the patient side, working from the insurance company's records, they identified patients who had experienced adverse health events that were temporally correlated with the period they were filling prescriptions at Marsh's pharmacy. They did not reach out to patients directly at this stage. Doing so would risk tipping off Marsh before the search warrant was secured. The search warrant for the pharmacy, Marsh's business records, and his personal computers was executed on the morning of November 14th, 2023. Marsh was present when investigators arrived. He was, by the accounts of multiple investigators in the room, calm in a way that was itself unusual. Not the calm of a man who is innocent and therefore not worried. The calm of a man who has rehearsed for this moment and decided on his approach. He handed over the keys to the storage room without being asked. He directed investigators to the filing cabinets. He answered questions politely. He did not mention the laptop. The laptop was found behind a false panel in the bottom of his personal office closet, a modification Marsh had apparently made to the closet some years earlier. The carpenter who had done the work confirmed, for extra storage. It was the laptop on which he maintained the double entry records of what was dispensed versus what was billed. When forensic technicians accessed it, they found 13 years of meticulous documentation of Elliot Marsh's own crimes, organized by year, by patient, and by drug category, with running total calculations that appeared to have been reviewed and updated regularly. Elliot Marsh's attorney later argued that the laptop constituted a privileged personal document. The argument was rejected at every judicial level at which it was raised. The trial of Elliot Marsh began in September 2024 and lasted 6 weeks. The prosecution's case was, by any legal standard, overwhelming. The laptop records alone constituted direct evidence of intent and method that is rarely available in fraud cases of this scale. What made the trial significant, beyond the verdict, was the defense strategy that Marsh's attorneys attempted. The defense argued that Marsh was the victim of a systemic problem in independent pharmacy economics, that the margin pressure created by insurance company reimbursement rates had created a class of small pharmacies that could not survive without some degree of billing flexibility, and that Marsh's conduct, while technically illegal, was an adaptive response to an unjust economic environment. The defense called 2 pharmacy industry economists as witnesses, both of whom testified to the genuine financial challenges facing independent pharmacies in the current market. The prosecution countered effectively with Margaret, and with Raymond, and with the other 15. The prosecution made the decision, in consultation with victims, to put several of the patients on the stand. It was a deliberate choice to prevent the case from becoming an abstraction, a financial fraud with no human face. Margaret, who testified with partial paralysis from her 2014 stroke, was on the stand for 45 minutes. She described getting dressed for her daughter's wedding and being unable to fasten a button. She described the first time she understood the stroke had been preventable. She said in a voice that the court reporter later described as completely steady, "I trusted him. I walked into that pharmacy for 22 years. I trusted him with my life, and he used that trust to steal from me, and I had a stroke." Elliot Marsh was convicted on all principal counts. He was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2031. He is 60 years old. His pharmacy was permanently closed. His pharmacist's license was revoked permanently. The civil litigation, brought by 9 of the 17 hospitalized patients, settled out of court for a total amount that has not been publicly disclosed. This case raises a question that is, I think, more important than Elliot Marsh's individual criminality. Why did it take 13 years? The insurance fraud occurred between 2009 and 2022. The first patient was hospitalized in 2011. By 2016, the pattern of patients experiencing unexpected health deterioration while under Marsh's pharmacy was, in retrospect, detectable. If anyone had been looking for it, no one was. The systemic gap that allowed Marsh to operate for 13 years is the disconnect between clinical patient records and pharmacy dispensing records. A patient's doctor knows what was prescribed. The pharmacy knows what was dispensed. The two systems in most jurisdictions do not automatically cross-check against each other in real time. When a patient has an adverse health event, the clinical system looks at the prescription and assumes it was filled correctly. The discrepancy between the prescription and the dispensed drug is, in most cases, invisible unless someone specifically requests a medication reconciliation audit, which typically only happens in institutional settings, not in community pharmacy care. The insurance fraud detection system caught the financial discrepancy first, before the patient harm was fully mapped. This is, in one sense, an indictment. The money was more legible to the system than the harm to human health. In another sense, it is a practical argument for more sophisticated cross-system data integration in pharmaceutical care. Several states have introduced legislation in the wake of the Marsh case to require real-time cross-system prescription verification. The pharmaceutical industry has lobbied against some of these measures on the grounds of operational burden. The debate continues. Elliot Marsh built his fraud on trust, specifically on the trust that medical professionals receive from patients who are, by definition, in a position of physical vulnerability. The patients who walked into his pharmacy were trusting him with the thing they valued most: their health, their ability to be present for the people who depended on them, their physical continuity in the world. He calculated that this trust was a resource he could exploit because the exploitation was structurally invisible. He was right for 13 years. Then an algorithm saw a pattern in a spreadsheet, and a fraud analyst felt that something was wrong in a specific way, and that structural invisibility ended. What I take from Elliot Marsh's story is not that all pharmacists are suspect. They are not. What I take is that trust in any professional relationship should be robust enough to survive a challenge. Medication reconciliation, second opinions, annual pharmacy reviews for patients on long-term prescriptions. None of these are signs of distrust toward individual pharmacists. They are the structural habits of a healthcare system that takes seriously the proposition that no single point of contact should be the only safeguard between a patient and harm. In the description below, I have linked to a patient advocacy organization that publishes guidance on pharmacy safety, medication reconciliation, and what to do if you believe there may be a discrepancy in your prescriptions. This information should not be necessary. Elliot Marsh is the reason it is. It